Hey, welcome back everyone to the Progressive Brothers Podcast. This is episode 89. I'm here with my co-host, Renaissance Man.
Hey, welcome back everyone. Peace to everyone in the chat. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell.
Also, make sure you follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcasts. The radical left. During the Trump administration, he made his declaration that the radical left was a problem and that needed to be solved. And his position was that CRT, cancel culture, BLM, democratic, political demonstrations in the street were considered to be radical, and it needed to be tackled with more bureaucracy or even confronting them in public. And what I think is happening here, and what has happened over time, is that you've had people who have taken liberty into their own hands and confronting the left. And recently in Kenosha, you had a Rainbow Coalition, Push Coalition, doing a peaceful demonstration after the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict. And after the verdict was read and he was found not guilty, many leftist organizations organized to build solidarity out in the street after the non-conviction. But what changed here is that you saw a lot more Second Amendment talk, or you heard more Second Amendment talk, and you saw a lot more firearms come out. More AR-15s than I've seen in a long time on either side. And the left seemed to be regrouping and coming back armed. And so, Renaissance Man, what's your take on the left becoming more aggressive in their message and taking up arms in the street?
I think I actually don't think it's the best idea, only because it plays into the hands of the right, in that it gives credence to somewhat to what they're saying. Also, I think they give up some leverage in the sense of, one of the things is you can always, the right, specifically in this country in the past like 40, 50 years, has always been responsible for the majority of violence, politically motivated violence. It's just a statistic if you go back and look at it. It ebbs and flows as far as how much, but if you look at it over time, it tends to always be the right wing, whether it be, Timothy McVeigh or a Dylan Roof type, or, any of these radicalized right wing type of people that resort to violence. The guy in Texas who killed a large portion of the Hispanic community a few years back. You see that, and you really don't see that from the left. And what you do see is, like, for example, you hear people on the right always talking about things like the chop zone in Seattle and, what happened there, someone getting shot and them taking over. So the one thing I do worry about it with more radical people coming out is that it's going to play into the right's hands and basically excuse their violence, which is a lot more extreme. January 6th, all of those things. When you're ever in a conversation with one of these people, one of the things they always try to point back to is, oh, well, look at BLM protests in the summer and, a summer long of riots. And when, I believe it was New York Times did a study that said like 95% of the protests that people engaged in were peaceful. So that's the only thing I worry about is, you get more radical people out there with guns. You might get people out there trying to provoke them to escalate some violence and paint the movement in a negative way. Or you get more people who try to confront them in the sense of like police that use it as a justification of, not that I'm saying police aren't, you've already got police who, when you look at how January 6th was dealt with and how BLM protests, police are already aggressive, but to me, you give them almost more the chance to be even more aggressive with left-wing and BLM protesters.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because you're right that black people, the left with firearms, was always met with some form of aggression. We saw that with Philando Castile, just legally possessing a firearm got him killed. But I think to not take up arms now would spell a lot of doom in the future, because if they don't prepare now, I mean, Kyle Rittenhouse was just, he killed a couple of people and wounded a third. But what happens when you have 5 or 6 different Kyle Rittenhouses and you have nothing to return fire with, or you have no way to defend yourself? I think that becomes problematic. And I think, from my perspective, I think it's best to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. I consider myself to be progressive and on the left, but I'm also a huge advocate of Second Amendment, or the possession of legally owning a firearm, whether it's carrying concealed or in your household. But in this instance, we do have growing aggression against peaceful demonstrations. We saw this in DC when you had the Proud Boys show up. They're tearing down signs for BLM. They're burning churches and defacing them, and beating people, stabbing people in the street. We saw this in January 6th, how violent they got when they stormed the Capitol. I just think that the left on the street is different than the left who are politically elected or democratically elected. And so those who are democratically elected are looking at this and saying, the system works and you should trust the system, trust the process. And I'm saying the people on the street are looking at this and saying, we don't really trust the system. So I think you're starting to see the left kind of move further to the middle, if not the right. I don't want to say they're on the right, but I do think that they're moving away from Elizabeth Warren and more towards the middle. I say Elizabeth Warren because I consider her to be kind of on the tipping edge of the left. They're moving more towards the middle, and they're starting to say, hey, I'm all for peaceful demonstrations, but if you come near me, this is not going to end well for you. And I think if we get to that point, and we're probably at that point now, you're going to see a lot more incidents happen that we had never seen before. Because I remember protesting, 2009, 2011, that time frame. The idea of having a firearm was like unheard of. You didn't think about having a firearm when you were protesting on the left. Now, having a firearm is almost as commonplace as holding up a placard. And I would say probably having a firearm is your placard at this point.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say too is I think how you go about it as well too. Now that you frame it that way, I wouldn't have a problem with concealed carry, as long as obviously you don't want to break any laws. And a lot of these protests that the left engaged in, are in cities. Concealed carry tends to be a lot more difficult to obtain unless it's in a deep red state like a Georgia, something like that. But if you're in a DC or something like that, it's gonna be a different game. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Seattle is gonna be just a different game. Somewhere like Wisconsin, obviously, blue state, but still has very much a reddish feel to it as well too. So maybe a lot more lax in the gun laws as well there. So I wouldn't have any issue there. I think open carry, that gives too much of in the sense of guys walking around with AR-15s the same way Kyle Rittenhouse does. To me, that gives police and these people just way too much of a excuse to be aggressive with protesters when it's not necessary. If it's concealed and and people can't see it, then it's like, okay, if you don't know it's there, then obviously how can you justify pulling out billy clubs, pepper spraying people, all the things that you see, bringing out tanks, all those things along those lines. But I will say I've seen a couple of mini docs on this. The sentiment you're expressing is actually very much growing within the left, in the sense of, you're very much seeing, the radicalizing of the right, lots of militias, people feeling that they can take up arms, confront people. You're seeing leftists, who are learning to shoot A lot of people who are black. There was a big surge in black gun ownership, I believe, during the pandemic, and during Trump's administration in general, just because of the blatant racism and people feeling that really emboldened that they can say and do whatever. So you started to see, like, I believe the National African American Gun Association said, under Trump, their memberships and inquiries shot up significantly. And, opening different chapters, I believe there's now up to like maybe 10,000 members. So, and then I saw, you had people on the left who, they are, obviously feeling like, hey, I need to protect myself. So they're looking at firearms, but obviously they don't want to go join an NRA or, some of these other groups that are associated with right wing just because of, how they're going to be perceived, the rhetoric, what the group stands for. So you're starting to see the creation of some of these, whether they be people who are leftists in just ideology, or people who are members of the LGBT community, or people who are members of the trans community. Those communities you've seen an uptick as well, because they've seen a lot of bigotry directed their way as well too, in the midst of this rise in right-wing populism.
Very good point you brought up about police bringing out billy clubs and trying to apprehend peaceful protesters, using pepper spray. I saw one demonstration, I think it was out in LA, where you had these really radical far-right guys beating people with bike locks and using bear spray. If you had protesters on the left who were carrying concealed, that would probably end in a different way, where you won't have the advantage or even the perception that you can just walk up to an average person on the left and just try to manhandle them. That would end differently, and that would probably change the course of action on both sides, because if somebody gets popped over that, they'll think twice across the country. Maybe you should not put your hands on people who are peacefully demonstrating. Maybe law enforcement will look at this and say, well, he does have the legal right to carry, and maybe we shouldn't be pepper spraying these people and beating them over their heads like they were in Seattle, I think it was, where they were beating people over the heads. And so even in Washington, D.C., I saw quite a few times, they were using horses to kind of as a barricade or a battering ram against the protesters. The horse kind of trotting around, and I mean, you get stepped on by a horse, you're talking 1,000+ pounds stepping on your foot or any one of your limbs. You're in some serious trouble at that point. So I just think that, to your point, law enforcement and other people would probably think twice about putting their hands on people in that regard. I think what it would do, though, also is basically allow people to feel more confident in their message, because people don't always feel confident. That's why a lot of people stopped coming out, I think, after the George Floyd protests were all over. You saw less and less people having demonstrations. Before, you saw massive demonstrations, massive gatherings and stuff like that. Now you've seen significantly less, probably 80% drop in participation. I think even with small participation, if people are armed, you have, a dozen people armed, concealed, and they're walking around in these protests. They may be chanting, but you would be, they would feel a lot more emboldened to stand their ground, so to speak, when it comes to peaceful demonstrations. People would think twice. What I did see in Kenosha over the weekend was they were actually using vehicles, SUVs, to protect the protesters up front. So the protesters would be walking up front, but the vehicles were had their hazard lights on and were put in a formation where another vehicle would not be able to get through that crowd, which I thought was a really ingenious strategy that they pulled.
Yeah, the one thing you mentioned about people, if people being armed, basically the people not being as emboldened. I think also what plays into it, we hear it a lot in this space that, oh, he's a leftist, they associate it with just basically, rainbow flags and, guys who just, don't fit the mold of masculine or what they feel like, guys who they call, basically, beta males, things like that. That is the image. And that's not just the black ministry, really in general. That's what a lot of people kind of associate with the left in the political discourse is these people. So I think that plays into that image, or that imagery that's been crafted by the media sort of plays into that as well, where these guys feel like, I'm this, super masculine, tough guy walking around with AR-15, and I can go, deal with these lefties who are going to go cry and need a safe space, after dealing with me. You know what I mean? So that's another element that I think plays into that, and that may also sort of play into what you were saying as far as, hey, people being armed and prepared to confront and deal with this type of aggression may change some of that narrative as well.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't think we would ever get down to this path of people arming up and pulling. I mean, not just picking up pistols. I mean, we're talking about long barrel AR-15 legally possessed firearms. The same one Kyle Rittenhouse had used in his incident. Many other people are also carrying those arms on the left, and I'm starting to think we're moving into a different political space that we hadn't seen before. Because in other countries, they don't really arm themselves like that at protests. That's just like unheard of. Like, I mean, you may have some people in like military, replicated gear, but nothing to the extent that what we have in the United States, where people just show up, like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, anything like that. The NFAC, I'm reminded, is probably the largest armed demonstration, open carry armed demonstration on the black side that I've seen in a long time. I haven't seen anything like that before. I mean, I was probably 16 when the first Million Man March was held in Washington, D.C. And I don't remember guys carrying firearms there, but a million black men, sent chills not just down, the far right, but also in Washington itself. That what if these guys came armed? Well, they were not armed, from my understanding, and so they came there peaceful and practiced peaceful demonstration. And so I think it's interesting to see where the left has gone, from, let's say, the Clinton administration to today. The Obama administration, you didn't really need to have these sort of radical protests in the capacity that you have now, but because I think people were more satisfied with seeing Obama in the actionables that were coming out of the White House and Washington as a whole. I think people were a lot more satisfied back then, but now people are like, nah, I'm not going for X, Y, and Z anymore. I'm not going for the okie doke. We're going to take this to the next level. If this guy gets off, then we're taking to the street. If we don't see some, if there's no justice, no peace. People are starting to become a little bit more, I guess, kinetic in their way of movement. I'm seeing, fist fights occur, and people losing teeth. Noses are bleeding, and now you have people storming the Capitol. Now you have, right-wing groups organizing to kidnap governors and lieutenant governors and whatnot. When have we ever seen anything like that, in our time?
Oh no, I mean, it's like I said, we're at a new place. You did see obviously things like Timothy McVeigh, right-wing violence kind of against institutions, but like you said, kidnapping governors, storming the Capitol, it's just, and it's, people have become desensitized to it because a lot of people want to move on from January 6th, the whole, kidnapping the governors, guys obviously got caught, are going to get prosecuted and end up in jail, but it's, the alarm bells that people really think that this is justified and okay, and obviously this comes from Trump, sending out tweets saying, hey, liberate Michigan, things like that. So guys felt emboldened from that. But it's just, yeah, who would have thought that's where we'd be?
Yeah, definitely. I just think my final thoughts on this is that we're entering into a dimension that I don't think we can ever roll back. I don't see the left putting down their firearms at any given point going forward. I think that this is going to be the new normal, and people on the right and those who are in opposition will probably be met with equal force if they decide to engage peaceful protesters from now on going forward. I thought that, I heard in during the Ahmaud Arbery trial when Jesse Jackson showed up that people were that some of these far right guys were threatening him on social media. And I thought that was crazy. I heard Roland Martin, I watched him live, and he was really angry about that. He told them basically, if you think about coming down here to attack Jesse Jackson, you're going to have your work cut out for you, because people are down there pretty much ready to go. So
yeah, it's creating definitely a different atmosphere, and you also got to wonder about the press too. I'm sure they tend to be at these events as well too. More of these guys showing up. Kind of goes back to January 6th. You remember that scene where all the rioters and protesters were basically breaking the press's gear. Like, you literally see it looks like some very expensive equipment that they basically destroyed, because they hate the press as well too. So what is that? What's the implications there with this new heightened environment?
Much to see. Like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcast.